we're going to get this party started. I'm going to apologize a little bit in advance because, we're all living that quarantine life still. I have a dog. She's given me indications over the course of the evening that she might start making noises. And my wife Jess is also on a phone call, so you might be able to hear her in the background. Our house isn't that big. With that, I'll just go ahead and introduce myself. Thank you so much for joining. I'm Ross Morales Rocketto. I'm one of the co-founders of Run for Something. For those of you who don't know, Run for Something recruits and supports young, diverse, progressive folks who are running for state and local office for the first or second time. We are founded in the aftermath of the 2016 election, and since then have endorsed and worked with more than 1,600 candidates from across all 50 states and have elected almost 500 folks. And of those folks, about 55% of them identify as women, 56% identify as people of color, and 21% identify as LGBTQI+. Since we've got started, we've had over 76,000 people around the country in all 50 states tell us that they're interested in running for office. And honestly, we're just getting this party started. So I'd like to welcome you to this last event in this week's Front Row series. Every evening this week, we've hosted different conversations with really amazing national figures, as well as Run for Something alum, about a lot of the topics that really matter right now. I'm really honored to be facilitating tonight's conversation. We're going to talk about the many facets of voter suppression with some really incredible leaders. Before we jump in, I just want to take the time to thank the folks who made tonight possible, specifically the folks on our National Host Committee, as well as our sponsors, Authentic Campaigns, Planned Parenthood, Precision Strategies, Civis Analytics, and NUCO. I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank Mary, who's our American Sign Language interpreter. We're really glad that she's able to be here tonight. And with that, I'd love to introduce you to our incredible panelists. I'm going to introduce them all first, then we'll pull up their video, and then we'll get into it. So our first panelist tonight is Marc Elias. Full disclosure, Marc's firm actually represents Run for Something, and we're very grateful for their counsel and for keeping us out of election jail. That means that Marc is an attorney specializing in election law, voting rights, and redistricting. He's a partner at Perkins Coie and heads the firm's political law practice. He previously served as a general counsel for Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign and John Kerry's 2004 presidential campaign. Marc oversaw the state-by-state response to lawsuits filed by the Trump campaign contesting the 2020 election results on behalf of the Biden campaign and the DNC. And in 2020, he founded Democracy Docket, a website on voting rights and election litigation in the US. I get it. I read it every week. You should subscribe. I'm sure he'll talk about it a little bit later. Next up, we have Representative Malcolm Kenyatta. Malcolm is a state representative in Pennsylvania, representing Philadelphia. He currently serves as a vice chair of the Philadelphia delegation and as a member of the governor's task force on suicide prevention and on a host of other leaders, has a lot of other leadership positions. He's the first openly LGBTQ person of color and one of the youngest members elected to the Pennsylvania General Assembly. As a legislator, he's championed proposals addressing generational poverty, raising the minimum wage, protecting workers' rights, increasing access to mental health care, and common sense measures to address gun violence, as well as protecting digital infrastructure. In 2020, he was chosen by now President Joe Biden to give the keynote address at the DNC convention, along with a group of other rising stars, including Judge Lina Hidalgo, who's also here with us tonight. A little bit earlier this year, Representative Kenyatta also announced his campaign for U.S. Senate in Pennsylvania, and his campaign raised about $400,000 in less than 6 weeks after announcing he's one of the front runners in that race. And we're really excited and couldn't be prouder that he's in that fight. Our next panelist is Judge Lina Hidalgo. She is the county judge for Harris County. And for those who don't know, the county judge position acts as the county executive in Harris County. It's Texas. I can't tell you why it is the way it is. It just is. Judge Hidalgo, as I said, is the head of Harris County's governing body. She's the first woman to be elected county judge and only the second to be elected to the commissioner's court. Harris County, for those who also don't know, is the third largest county in the country. It has a population of about 4.5 million people, which means that it's bigger than about 25 states. Uh, the Harris County judge and 4 commissioners oversee a budget of over $4.3 billion, and that helps fund key county services and institutions. And since taking over, she's led Harris County through hurricanes, floods, chemical fires and explosions, COVID, the recent freeze that happened in Texas, and she's also spearheading the vaccination efforts for Harris County. In addition to all that, since taking over, she's also been able to end cash bail, created a $30 million emergency fund for residents hardest hit by COVID, and ran one of the most open and accessible elections in the entire state of Texas. Uh, I'm also, full disclosure, am from Harris County. I grew up in Houston, and my parents currently live there. So next up, we have Secretary Julian Castro, who's a former presidential candidate, Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, Mayor of San Antonio, and City Council member from San Antonio. During his tenure at HUD, he increased access to fair housing rights, aided communities struck by natural disasters, and launched a program that increased broadband connectivity to young people across the country. As mayor, Secretary Castro brought a strong focus for expanding educational achievement. Specifically, he implemented the pre-K for SA program, which is one of the nation's first universal pre-K programs, and he has earned praise as one of America's strongest. He's from Texas and made history in 2012 when he became the first Latino ever to deliver the keynote address at the Democratic National Convention. And after his historic presidential campaign in 2020, Secretary Castro launched People First Future, an organization designed to help bold progressive candidates whose campaigns are focused on improving the lives of all of the people they hope to represent in them. In September, Secretary Castro launched a podcast called Our America with Julian Castro, that puts a spotlight on vulnerable communities and takes a humanizing and hopeful look at how drastically the American experience shifts from one person to the next. Last up, but certainly not least, we have Lieutenant Governor Garlin Gilchrist, who currently serves as Lieutenant Governor for the state of Michigan. He was also, fun fact, the first ever candidate endorsed by Run for Something back in 2017 when he was running for Detroit City Clerk. This is really fun. He received his first computer at the age of 5 and set up a computer lab in Detroit at a community recreation center using computers that he built himself at the age of 16. Lieutenant Governor studied computer engineering and computer science at the University of Michigan and later had a successful career as a software engineer at Microsoft. He then spent the next several years as a social entrepreneur and community organizer, helping communities across America realize their full economic and political potential. He returned home to Detroit and worked with local governments to help build systems that would make government more responsive, transparent, accountable to its city residents. And this experience prepared him for a key priority to bring Michigan State's government fully into the 21st century on every level. As a part of the Whitmer administration, Lieutenant Governor Gilchrist has also sought to address injustice and inequality across the state at every level. He co-chairs the Michigan Joint Task Force on Jail and Pretrial Incarceration. He's also helming the Coronavirus Task Force on Racial Disparities. And these task forces specifically have taken actions that have saved lives for some of our most vulnerable populations. And with that, I've now introduced everyone. You can turn your cameras on. And as folks are turning their cameras on, I will start by asking, we're going to just do a little round robin on this. And I'm just going to let you guys jump in as you want to. We'll start with a little icebreaker, which is, what has brought you joy, like in the time of COVID? I'll let whoever wants to jump in first, just go for it.
I've got an easy answer ready, Ross. And I'm wearing my running watch this morning, and I went for a longish run this morning, which means I'm really hungry right now because I didn't eat enough today. But my source of joy has been running, and we've had unseasonably cool weather here in the Houston area in Harris County. So we have like really, really nice, like 70-degree weather when we should already be, having intense Texas heat. So all of that combined has been my joy, and it's good to be with everybody.
So I'll be the opposite of that, if that's okay. So while the judge is running, I was baking, and so that was been a big trying my hand at baking. I'm watching every single episode of the Great British Bake Off multiple times, and becoming sort of obsessed with all manner of baking shows. While the judge was out being healthy, I was piling up calories.
So this is Garlin, Gilchrist in Michigan. So great to be here with the Run for Something family. And I got to say, Judge Hidalgo, if 70 degrees is unseasonably cool, it snowed here in Detroit yesterday. So I don't think you'll be running up here is what that sounds like. For me, my wife and I had a baby girl who was born on Juneteenth of 2019. And so the beautiful thing has been us and our twin 7-year-olds being able to be at home playing with the baby a little more since we were all, being safe during COVID.
Mine's very similar. I guess the silver lining for me is that, over the last few years, I was on the road probably 70% of the time, especially during the presidential campaign. And during this time of the pandemic, I've been at home 95% of the time. And I've had a lot of time to spend with my 12-year-old daughter, Karina, and my 6-year-old son, Christian, who just went back in person to school over the last couple of weeks. So it felt a little bit wistful, like it was the end of something that, it feels like we're not going to recapture that time.
Yeah, and I'd give a slight twist on that. My kids are both in college, and although they would certainly not have liked to have been back at home at all, they were forced to be home for part of last year and then part of this year. My son's actually graduating with a degree in engineering, so I don't know where he got that from, but there is a bitter sweetness to it, but a real joy, and looking forward in a couple of weeks to his graduation.
Mark, I support all engineering students, just for the record.
It's unbelievable what they go through. I just can't. I just don't know where he got it from.
My kind of guy.
That's awesome, Mark. I was hoping you were gonna talk about your dog. I hope you talk about your dog at some point.
Bodie is right. Bodie's right here with me.
Mark has a famous dog, or it's a Twitter famous dog. All right, we're gonna actually start we have some awesome questions here. We're gonna start them with you, Mark. You're one of the country's foremost experts on the topic of voter suppression and honestly all things voting. So I think it makes sense to do a little bit of level setting here. Voter suppression is a nebulous term. It often gets confused by folks. And I just love if you can just help us here by telling us, like, starting out with like what voter suppression is, how it's evolved over the history of our country, and then sort of like what you're doing from a legal perspective to help stop it.
Yeah, so I'm glad you asked the question of what it is, because to hear some people talk now, Republicans, voter suppression only covers things that absolutely prevent people from voting, and that isn't true. Voter suppression is where politicians choose voters rather than voters choose politicians. So gerrymandering is a form of voter suppression, but so are obstacles that are put in place of access to voting. So are differentials in wait times. In Georgia, for example, we sued Georgia during the primary. In the 6 metro counties, if you were in a 90% or more Black voter registered district, you waited online an average 51 minutes. If you were in a 90% or more white district, precinct rather, you waited in line 6 minutes. So that's a form of voter suppression, right? Where within the same counties, Black voters are waiting substantially longer in line than white voters. In Florida, we saw that if you were 18 to 21, your rate of rejection for a mail ballot was 5.4%. If you were over 65, the rate of rejection was 0.6%. It's the difference between 1 in 20 versus 1 in 200. That's a form of voter suppression. So voter suppression is whenever the state is structuring their rules or their elections in a way that make it harder to vote unnecessarily, where the measure, the obstacles, that the rules that have been put in place are not there to make elections easier to administer, but rather are there to prevent people from voting. And we know that when states do that, they don't hit all populations the same. They inevitably disenfranchise Black, brown, and young voters, and that's true in that's been true in Texas. I mean, you could write a whole textbook on just Texas. That has been true, which is probably the worst place for voting in the country. I'm sorry to say, since I have a bunch of Texans on the phone, not on the phone, on the Zoom. It's also true with what Republicans have tried to achieve in Pennsylvania. And are now trying to achieve in Michigan. So that's I think the best way I could explain it.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. I mean, as Mark mentioned, like voter suppression shows up in a bunch of different ways. So this one is for everyone. Just jump in as the spirit sort of moves you. I'd love if each of you can talk about like how voter suppression has specifically showed up in your own like local communities.
I mean, Michigan right now, we're seeing a really, and so I like the way that Mark described it. I see it as the 39 pieces of legislation that have been introduced in Michigan. I've characterized them as being anti-voter turnout, meaning that the barriers being placed between voters and their potential freedom to vote here in the state of Michigan, you know, the only problem that I can identify that they're solving is the fact that we've had record voter turnout in the last 2 elections that have happened statewide in Michigan. And so this is seeking to make that more difficult, meaning, you know, these new proposed ID requirements, there is not an ID problem when it comes to voting in Michigan, yet somehow the Republicans are introducing these barriers to make it more difficult for people who don't have these IDs to vote. And so that is something that is clear and specific. The fact that the voters in Michigan in 2018, alongside at the same time electing myself lieutenant governor, Gretchen Whitmer the governor, we also passed a significant expansion of access to voting. We passed a law in Michigan that made it possible for people to vote absentee without providing an excuse, something that was critical to our record voter turnout during the pandemic. And you know, that turnout, and which led to, you know, President Biden, that led to Vice President Kamala Harris. Like when Michigan was called, that's when the GSA was unlocked to work with them in the transition. Like this was so important. And the GOP has been so freaked out by that they are immediately trying to put all the stops to make it more difficult for people to vote in Michigan, because when more people vote in Michigan, it's clearly, at least in their eyes, and I think in reality, better for Democrats. And so we really are working to fight these tooth and nail. And I will say one of the unique challenges we have in our state is that we're going to see Republicans try to use a loophole to get around the voters and get around the governor who will veto these bills whenever they come to our desk. And so we got to pull all the stops in Michigan. This is really going to be ground zero for the effort to make it more difficult to vote in the country.
I've got a couple of stories, and you know, in Texas, in many counties, and it used to be this way in Harris County, is you could only vote on your precinct, your home precinct, on election day. And so as a candidate, you know, I would go and shake hands outside the 1,000-foot mark with voters when there were lines, because there were lines, multi-hour lines, and I saw myself, and many folks saw, people turned away because they showed up at, you know, 7:30 or 5 minutes past 7, because they simply couldn't get there. They couldn't get to their home precinct from their work, from picking up the kids, whatever it is, on time. That's one of the things we changed as soon as we got into office. The very first meeting of Commissioners Court, January 5th, 2019, or whatever it was make it possible for folks to vote anywhere on election day. So that's a victory. On the other side of things, there's the nurse that I heard about when visiting our 24-hour voting location at the Texas Medical Center this past November. We instituted drive-through voting. We instituted 24-hour voting as well. And this nurse had just gotten off her shift, and she walked by the polling location and inside, one of the hospitals, and she just broke down in tears because she couldn't believe that someone was doing something for her. For months she'd been fighting in the front lines of COVID, and so much was being asked for her, and now suddenly there was a convenience. Now, in one of the bills in the state legislature currently seeks to get rid of 24-hour voting. I was just at a voting location this morning, a drive-through voting location in one of the most Republican-leaning areas of Harris County. It just so happens to be the busiest of our drive-through voting location. They tell me it's young families and seniors who are using it. And again, there's a bill trying to get rid of that. So, we talk a lot in abstractions about the bills that are going through the legislature, and I can go into that more later, but I've definitely seen the human impacts of what's happening. And it's just heartbreaking, irrespective of party.
I know that Mark has been on the front line of a lot of this, but I think the sort of avalanche of lawsuits around voting also have a suppressive effect. Here in Pennsylvania in 2019, we passed what was later referred to as Act 47, the most significant and expansive overhaul of our voting in Pennsylvania's history, frankly. This was done on a bipartisan basis. Frankly, more Republicans voted for it than Democrats, in large part because they got rid of straight ticket voting. But on the other side, what it did was it expanded absentee voting, where we have no excuse absentee. It authorized drop boxes. It did things so folks could apply to register to vote closer to the election. And so while we were undergoing significant changes that our county commissioners were having to implement and that voters were having to get used to, the former president and his supporters were, every day in court challenging one aspect or the other, whatever was helping in their mind. Democrats, they wanted to challenge that. What they were doing at the post office and Postmaster General DeJoy, his different efforts. And so what that looked like was folks reaching out to my office repeatedly, seeing me in the grocery store, and really, really worried about whether or not their vote would count. If they applied absentee and put it in the mailbox, I had people saying, Malcolm, it's never going to get there, but I don't trust these drop boxes because the president's supporters were outside one early voting location trying to physically get in right in my district. And so it created this sense of uncertainty, not only about the result of the election, but uncertainty in a lot of ways that did keep some folks from engaging until the very last minute, meaning that seniors and others who I saw be the most fearful of the change had to go out into a pandemic to make sure their voices were heard.
I think that everybody has said well kind of what so many of us see these days. I mean, I grew up in San Antonio in a predominantly Mexican American community, and we saw throughout the decades the impact of voter suppression. We also saw the impact that structural changes can make, especially single member districts, for instance, and the introduction of that to local government, the huge difference that it can make in representation. But more recently, of course, in Texas, we've seen something like 750 polling locations be closed since 2012. We've seen a lot of polling locations shift. They were one place, in 1 year, then in another place in another year. And so it causes just at a ground level for everybody who's campaigned out there. You know how confusing that gets, especially to folks who may not be regular voters. And then, of course, as I think Lina mentioned, there's legislation right now in the Texas legislature that would restrict further convenient access to the ballot. Everything from trying to peel back the great work that she and her colleagues did in Harris County, like drive-through voting, 24-hour voting. By the way, I stopped by one of those, that Texas Medical Center voting site, the 24-hour one, and saw it in action, and it was fantastic for these shift workers. So we know that, you know, to the extent that we expand the franchise, we're going to get better participation, and especially for communities of color, a stronger chance for them to elect their first choice candidates. And if we go in the opposite direction that so many of these Republicans want to go in, it's just going to get harder and harder for people to participate.
Thanks, y'all. So the next question I've got specifically is for you, Secretary Castro. I watched some of your testimony today, you know, for before the House of Representatives. You know, you spoke, you know, today specifically on voting rights and the history of voter suppression, especially in Texas. I'd love, you know, you also have a family connection to all of this. So I'd love if you can talk about that family connection, the struggle for voting rights in Texas that goes back decades, and the work that like still needs to get done.
Yeah, you know, I testified this morning before a subcommittee of the House Judiciary Committee as they consider the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, updating the Voting Rights Act after what the Supreme Court did to it, specifically gutting Section 4B, essentially Section 5, a preclearance section of the Voting Rights Act. And I talked about the history of voter suppression in Texas, from the poll tax, literacy tests that were done not only in Texas, but other places, to more recently, the things that I just mentioned a moment ago. I mean, as Mark said, Texas has been the worst. I mean, like, they've been the most devious, the most consistent, the most rabid at trying to suppress the vote, particularly of Black and brown communities. And they're at it again in this legislative session. I mentioned in my opening remarks that I had a personal connection because, as I think most of y'all know, my mom was a hellraiser when she was young. She was a Chicana activist. And as part of that, she was actually a member of a team of people that were doing research along with MALDEF, the Mexican American Legal Defense and Education Fund. That research on voter participation ultimately was part of what was prepared for testimony to the House Judiciary Committee when I believe they were considering what would become the expansion of the Voting Rights Act to language minorities in 1975. And so I said, you know, it's fitting that I'm here. My mom was kind of part of this 5 decades earlier, which, you know, makes me feel proud of her, but also is a little bit disappointing, right? Because we shouldn't have to fight those same fights 50 years later. But if we have to fight them, then we will fight them. And that's what everybody on this Zoom has been doing.
Thanks. And I love the story. And Judge Hidalgo, you're next. Like Secretary Castro, you know, you've been really outspoken on the potential impacts that the voter suppression bills currently being considered in the Texas legislature will have. And, you know, you mentioned, you know, that you visited like one of the Kingwood drive-through location earlier today. I'd love if you can get into a little bit more detail about what some of those impacts would be, and tell us like how that would impact the way that you directly are going to potentially have to manage elections going forward.
Yeah, it's almost surreal to think about what's in these bills. So the two main ones right now that are moving their way through the legislature are Senate Bill 7 and House Bill 6. And the scary part is, you know, I'm going to go over what it would do, but there's so many other things that could be tacked onto them in whatever bill ends up being finally voted on. that could be even worse. And the history of voter suppression in the state, it makes it so concerning. One of the most concerning parts of the bill for me, that I don't think is talked about enough, is these bills would allow partisan poll watchers, activists, to video record voters as they're casting their vote. And the bills specifically say that the poll watcher, and I hate calling them that because it's got sort of a positive connotation, that this partisan poll watcher would be able to get as close as they need to the voter in order to see what's going on. And it does say they're not supposed to see what exactly the voter is voting for, but it also says they can get as close as they need to. And then it says they can video record the voter, and the poll worker cannot interfere. If the poll worker so much as gets in between the line of vision between the poll watcher and the voter, the poll worker would be liable for a misdemeanor. I mean, it's just, it evokes the worst episodes in our history from decades ago and recent history of voter harassment. And you guys may have seen a video circulating online last week or a couple of weeks ago where the Harris County Republican Party was doing a training and recruiting quote unquote poll watchers for the problem areas that they need to go do this at. And it was specifically the Black and Hispanic areas of town. And so, what I think of immediately is, if these people who believe in the big lie that the election was stolen, if they're willing to storm the Capitol over this big lie, what are they going to be willing to do inside a polling location in a Black or brown community? So that makes it very difficult for us as government, for our poll workers, right, to be able to just so much as protect them and have a democratic, smooth election where everybody can vote for whoever they want to vote without feeling intimidated. There's other things, like there's a part of the bill that wants to limit mail ballot voting. So, here you do need an excuse to be able to vote by mail. And you guys were talking about in Michigan and Pennsylvania, y'all got rid of that, but here you still have to do it. And so what we did is, okay, well, we can't register folks for mail ballots, but we at least can send them mail ballot applications. So if they qualify, they can send it back. Well, now the bills are reacting to that, and they would forbid us from basically, it can be read to say that we can't even provide information about mail ballot, and us local electeds would be criminally liable for so much as informing voters about how to use the mail ballot process. So it really limits us. And then the final way in which it limits our ability to conduct a smooth election is the bills micromanage the way we would assign polling locations and voting machines. There have been historically incredibly long lines. And what we found over this past election is, if you're really smart in the way you assign them, and MIT has sort of an algorithm and a formula that helps us look at this, but there's other aspects to it, you can create functionally no lines. And that's what we had in 2020. We had the largest turnout we'd seen in 30 years. It was beautiful. People were thrilled. They loved drive-through voting and 24-hour voting and triple the number of early voting locations. And there were functionally no lines because we sent more machines to the areas where people like to vote and fewer to the areas where nobody tends to vote. And so they would take away that latitude and thereby lead again to long lines, which obviously, disenfranchises people. So it's worth noting all of us are from such different places, and yet the dominoes are falling. We have to continue fighting this and raising awareness and exchanging ideas as we're doing here.
Thank you. And for those who hadn't seen, on Twitter, Judge Hidalgo visited a voting booth from the 1970s, and it has automatic curtains on it, which I thought honestly was like one of the coolest things ever. And I kind of wish we had them at voting locations still. So if you haven't seen the video, it's really fun and you should look at it. Speaking of voting technology, next question is for you, Lieutenant Governor. You ran for city clerk in 2017. We know that improving voting systems is near and dear to you. You're now Lieutenant Governor of the state. what types of improvements are possible, and how will those types of improvements improve people's experience in voting? And honestly, like, why is that important?
Yeah, Ross, this is really important because, as you said, like, my first notion to get into public service was to open the doorway to democracy. And that was the whole premise of my campaign for Detroit City Clerk, about, making voting more available, more accessible, more fun, more real for people. And so now I get to work alongside a great Secretary of State here in Michigan. And while so the running election is not in my purview, but I do think we should talk about sort of, again, what should laws that are impacting voting, like what should they be optimized for? Like what should we be trying to accomplish? And I believe that we need to not only protect the freedom to vote, but we need to aggressively expand access to voting. Everyone on this Zoom would agree that enough people still aren't voting. Like we get really excited about the level of voter turnout. We had awesome voter turnout, relatively speaking, in Michigan in 2018 and in 2020, but it's not enough. There are I would love there to be actually 100% voter participation. And I don't think it's crazy to strive for that. So the question is, what are the things that are standing between people and voting? So putting aside the voter suppression efforts by the Republican Party, we need to think about, again, what makes it more convenient. And so for me, that's about access to, one, the ability to vote. So, breaking down all the barriers to registration. Voter registration should be so easy and available everywhere. We finally, again, in that voter-led petition in 2018, enable people to register to vote online in the state of Michigan, for example. We need to expand access to voter registration. We need voter registration, forms need to be everywhere there are forms. We need to make sure that these things are available to people in all their forms. It's really easy to register to vote from your phone. All these sorts of things are very important, making sure that people have that first step to access to the franchise. Second, I think we should aggressively expand the places where people can actually literally cast ballots. One of the reasons why drop boxes were so important is because, as Judge Hidalgo said, they were more convenient. I voted at a drop box for the first time. I've lived in Washington State as well as Washington, D.C. and in Michigan. So I lived in a state where I voted by mail, but I never voted by mail before in Michigan until this past election. What was really great in the general election, being able to take that ballot that I filled out of my home and take it to a drop box. That was awesome. That is an experience that we should allow for everyone to choose if it makes sense for them in their lives. We know that one of the reasons that people may not end up voting is because they may literally run out of time. Well, the drop box has more time than you do, because it just stays there all day and all night. So we should really make it easy for people to have a relationship with the drop boxes in their communities. We shouldn't be limiting access to them. We shouldn't be limiting the number of them, because again, more people voting is better for the political process. It leads to better candidates. It leads to better elected officials. It leads to better decision-making processes that lead to better results and outcomes that are more reflective of the desires of the community that we represent, because more people have participated in the process of making it possible. So I think we need to be thinking all about access and expansion. We should have an abundance mindset when it comes to voting and making sure that everyone has full access to that freedom in a way that makes sense for them. In so many other areas of life, we value flexibility. We value the ability to choose our own adventure and to choose to do things in a way that makes sense for them. We should not walk away from those principles when it comes to access to our most fundamental and foundational right as Americans, and that's to vote. And I certainly hope to work to make my state a model for that, even in the face of these attempts to erect barriers to that reality, or that potential reality. But I think with leaders like who are represented here, and the folks who are going to step up to run for offices across the country, with the help of Run for Something, I think all of your vision for democracy is an vision for one that's more inclusive, and that includes more voters. And I think that's the kind of democracy we all want to strive for.
That's awesome. And I voted by a drop box and it didn't speak to me. It didn't do anything. And honestly, that's what I was looking for when I voted in 2020. I didn't want anyone to talk to me. I just wanted to put my ballot in, call it a day. Representative Kenyatta, this next one's for you. We all saw and witnessed the shenanigans that Republicans tried to pull in Pennsylvania in 2020. We know what's coming in the next legislative cycle, for y'all. Like, they're going to, try to continue to take away people's rights as much as they're able to. You've been a fighter against, so many things that they've tried to do. But my question is actually, as a U.S. Senator, what would you try to do to help stop voter suppression?
Yeah, so, Ross, I've resigned myself to, I guess, really last year, to the fact that I'm probably no longer on the Christmas card list for many of my Republican colleagues, because I'm not a safe harbor for nonsense. And there's been a bunch of nonsense in Pennsylvania. If you go to the Republican caucus here in Pennsylvania, the 2020 election still isn't over. One of my colleagues was literally at a Stop the Steal rally on the steps of the Pennsylvania legislature literally just yesterday. We have undergone what was supposed to be 14, but turned to 10 different hearings outlining all the different ways in which the election was rigged and stolen, and all the different ways they were trying to showcase how broken Pennsylvania's election system is. But our system is only broken when folks try to make it more difficult for people to vote. And so not only have Republicans sought to come up with a bunch of unique ways to limit the franchise of voting, but they've also really tried to bastardize the oversight, real responsibility that we have as a legislative body to make sure we are overseeing the executive branch. But because the current governor is not a Republican, they've taken our serious constitutional authority and responsibility to really new heights. One of what they tried to do and actually passed it, and thank God they ultimately pulled it, and they blamed it on me and liberal media allies for really exposing what they were trying to do. They wanted to be able to, quote unquote, investigate the election as the election was occurring. It would have given the House of Representatives the authority to subpoena ballots, to impound voting machines, and most terrifying, it would have allowed our sergeant at arms and state police to go physically compel elections officials to come before sham hearings. And, in Pennsylvania, we have seen over and over and over again these really outrageous attempts to make it more difficult for folks to vote, but them trying to paper over it with this sense of, oh, this is bipartisan, this is inclusive, these are just normal steps. The chair of the state government committee, an incredibly powerful committee, I was Democratic secretary last session, this session, we oversee everything related to voting laws. The current chair of that committee was legislator of the year from ALEC, legislator of the year. He just had before us, such noted voting rights experts as members of the Heritage Foundation. And we're bringing them in as experts to talk about how messed up our system is. And so you can expect in Pennsylvania that they're going to be introducing, and already have introduced, but they will pass it because they have a majority in both chambers. They're going to pass laws to do something as it relates to voter ID, as it relates to signature matching, completely getting rid of a no excuse absentee, which they just voted for a year ago, completely getting rid of drop boxes, and really taking a page out of the books of all the other states that have moved forward already with voting restrictions. And so this is where the Senate and Congress really needs to step in. We need to get rid of the damn filibuster and then pass bold, aggressive legislation that actually protects folks' right to vote. That means passing H.R. 1, that means passing the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and making sure that there are rules of the road that don't allow for the gerrymandering that Mark spoke about earlier, which is another voter suppressive tactic. Don't allow some of the things that some of the other panelists have talked about today and that we've seen in other states that aren't represented here today. You know, when we fail to act, I say we because I'm telling you I'm going to be elected to the United States Senate. But when the Senate fails to act, it allows folks at the state level, which thankfully people have been paying a lot more attention to move forward with these really radical proposals to put a stranglehold on our democracy.
Thank you. All right, folks. We've talked a lot. There's been a lot of doom and gloom. Now we have about 15 minutes left, so we're getting to the hopeful part of the evening. You know, each one of you sort of has a different perspective and sort of you sit in a different place on this. What can we do? What is there to be done? What can government do? What can like the regular ordinary person do? Yeah, what is there to do? I'll let y'all, this is for all of y'all, so someone just jump in as the spirit compels you. I'll call on people. All right, I'm gonna, oh, I think Secretary Castro, you're on mute.
Yeah, no, I'll start. I mean, as usual, your name says it all, right? I mean, people can run for office, they can run for something, get involved. That's a great way to do it. I mean, when we're talking about communities of color, especially, right? I was thinking about this because, you know, as I said earlier, I was sort of following in my mother's footsteps and testifying today. This generation has so many opportunities out there to get into public service and make these policies affect what happens in legislatures, in, you know, city councils, in executive offices. So do that right now, push back in any way that you can, as a citizen, as an advocate, as a supporter of expanding the franchise. I mean, because there are hundreds of pieces of legislation in state legislatures that are trying to suppress the vote going on right now. And don't stop at just trying to beat back these voter suppression bills. We need to do what the best states out there on this have done: automatic voter registration, pre-registration for 16 and 17-year-olds. Like, we have to take it forward, you know, like we have to be on the offense. And so, you know, push and help make sure that we expand the franchise, not just defend against all this bad legislation. Those are a couple of things that people can do right now.
I think the Secretary's right. We need to participate. The way that in our democratic process, is a team sport, and the biggest team wins. Like, the way that you deal with people who try to suppress your vote is to overwhelm them. The way that you deal with people who are trying to cheat or trying to erect barriers voting is to overwhelm those barriers and those efforts. We need more. I talked about an abundance mindset before. That is to overwhelm what we're trying to defeat, but also to undergird what we're trying to achieve. And so I think that we need more people with more ideas from more perspectives and more backgrounds stepping up and making their voices heard. Like the Secretary said, as a voter, as a volunteer, as an activist, as a consumer. One of the things that we've seen, so you know, in Georgia, you had these big consumer brands, you know, make these statements about how terrible the voting laws were after the laws passed. Like, that's cool, but that was too late. So in Michigan, for example, we were happy to see that many of the largest employers in our state stepped up just a week or so ago to affirm their support of protecting the freedom to vote in Michigan, and not supporting how this legislation that's been proposed in our state would limit that and eliminate that for some people, and that's unacceptable. But there's always more that can be done, and so I think that we need to let those who stand between us and our vote and our voter turnout know that we're not going to go away, that we are going to persist, we are going to resist, and that we are going to assist those who are helping us make voting more accessible, more available, more attainable for more people. So I think we need to find the depths of that energy, whether it's inspired by anger or inspired by the excitement of opportunity to help more people vote who never voted before. That's our responsibility, because I think we should strive for an election where everyone votes. It's a very simple concept, and we can get there with the effort. And I think we have it in us to get there.
Ross, I'll build on what was just said by the Secretary and Lieutenant Governor very well. And thank you for ending with this question, because this is really depressing. You know, there are other serious things that all of our communities, we really need to be tackling and dealing with. It's Earth Day today, right? There is a crisis as it relates to climate change and whether or not we're going to save this planet. I know there are a bunch of billionaires figuring out how to get to Mars and everywhere else, but I can tell you I ain't going. So we're going to focus on saving this planet. There's issues with mass shootings that we've seen over and over and over again. I represent the third poorest district in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. There are issues around poverty. So there's a lot that government can do and should be doing. Instead, we are battling something that is so simple and so fundamental to a representative democracy, the idea that every person can vote. And so I get why people not only get cynical, but get tired. And so often I hear from young people, you know, Malcolm, I don't do politics. I'm so sick of that, so much noise, I don't do politics. And I remind them that, well, politics does you. Politics does you. And so whether or not you choose to engage, decisions are going to be made about your life and about your family and about our communities. And so I think a part of the way we combat that cynicism is certainly by running for office, as the Secretary said, is certainly by overwhelming them, as the Lieutenant Governor said. But then I think also reminding ourselves what is at stake. And I say it over and over and over again, there's nothing on a tablet somewhere that says America has to succeed. America has succeeded and will continue to succeed. We'll continue to expand the promise of America because more and more folks get engaged and demand that America succeeds. And so this is for every election. It's for all the marbles, and we can't take it for granted.
Yeah, I think, you know, everybody's made such crucial points, and there's a big reason why we should all fight for this, and it ties back to everything else. So many companies in Texas are coalescing against these voter suppression bills because they know it's the right thing to do, but also because these bills are bad for business. There was an independent study commissioned here by a well-known economic group, the Pearman Group, that found that we would lose about $14 billion as a state, about 700,000 jobs by 2025 if these bills passed. And some folks say, well, aren't you worried that by complaining about this, that will invite these economic losses? And I say, well, the folks that are promoting these bills are putting us in a position to face these economic losses. So the businesses need to do that. To the Lieutenant Governor's point, they need to do that now, not afterwards. And they also need to make sure and stop supporting candidates that are pushing these bills. The leaders, you know, need to speak out about against this, whether it's civic leaders, elected officials, whatever it is. For us as government, you know, working to make voting as accessible as we can, you know, we're still doing drive-through voting. It's like, you know, come and take it as long as you haven't changed the law. And if they do, we'll meet them at court. But for every individual citizen, I mean, the fact that there are accessible elections, it's a virtuous cycle. And somebody mentioned this, it may have been the Secretary. To the extent that you participate more, there's better oversight, and then there's better governance. We've seen folks get engaged when we've opened the door of county government. We have an innovative early childhood education program that we're launching, the criminal justice reform that Ross mentioned, juvenile justice reform, all kinds of reforms in budgeting, smarter performance-based budgeting, environmental work folks didn't think was possible in Harris County. I hope that'll inspire folks to keep voting. But if you draw up obstacles, then you break that virtuous cycle. There are some challenges that are so big, we have to tackle together in a bipartisan way, from top to bottom, from every corner of the community. And voting is one of them. Democracy is one of them. So there's no reason not to get involved. And the hopeful part of it is, in spite of all these challenges, the prize at the end of protecting the franchise, the right to vote, is a huge one, which is protecting who we are as a nation, our economy, our ideals, and just better governance on all kinds of issues.
So, first of all, thank to all of you for your leadership in this fight. I think when I'm asked the question, what can people do? The answer is, what can't they do? Kamala Harris, during her convention speech, the end of her convention speech, said that years from now, when this moment is past, and our children and our grandchildren will look in our eyes and ask us, where were you when the stakes were so high? They will ask us what it will like, and we will tell them. We will tell them not just how it felt, we will tell them what we did. So to everyone on this call, the question I ask is, what did you do? You know, I have been more critical of business than probably anyone else, because the statements they have put out have been largely the thoughts and prayers of American democracy. What are they doing? Coming out and condemning the Georgia law after it passes is all well and good. But what are they doing? Not just in Texas, and not just in Michigan, and not just in Pennsylvania. What did they do in Montana? Nothing. What did they do in Iowa? Nothing. What are they doing today in Arkansas, or in Kansas, or in New Hampshire? What are they doing in Florida and in Texas? And not just what is the business community doing, what are our elected officials doing? You know, you all have had the courage to stand up and say that this is what matters at this time of crisis in our democracy, and you're to be applauded. But so many other elected officials are not doing that. They are just hoping this passes so that this topic can go on and they can focus on taxes or, you know, government regulation. And so you all are doing what you can do. But for everyday Americans, for everyone, you can stand up in the town square. You won't have the same coverage that Julian Castro has when he stands up in the town square. But you know what? Your friends will listen. Your family will listen. Your relatives will listen. Your crazy uncle who voted for Donald Trump will listen. And what you need to do is to not hide from that conversation, not turn away from that conversation, not say it's an awkward thing when my client, my customer, my friend, my relative. You need to confront it everywhere you can. Because the fact is that Judge Hidalgo did something remarkable, which is deployed the kind of ingenuity that, frankly, if corporate America deployed, we'd have a lot more people, we'd get a lot closer to the goal of 100% voter turnout. You confronted some of the most restrictive voting laws in the country, and you found innovative, ingenious ways to increase voting. And so that's an obligation, not just of our elected officials and not just corporate America, but for everyday Americans. Like, everyone can be part of that. And so, yes, call your senator, call your congressman, do all of that, but don't just end with that. Take public action. You know, run for something if that's your thing. But if it's not doing that, volunteer for a campaign, knock doors. But you got to do something.
That feels like a great note to end on. It also happens to be 9 o'clock exactly Eastern time. So it means that we're ending exactly on time. I just want to take a second to thank all of the panelists, all of you. I have some kind of relationship with all of you. You are all incredible people. You are all doing incredible work. And it's really, truly been an honor to get to moderate this panel with y'all. And I want to thank everyone who joined in. It really, the Run for Something community is what makes Run for Something special. I don't say that lightly. Everyone who's joined over the last, 4 nights to watch these events, some of these things can be angering and depressing. But at the end of the day, we all have some part to play in making a change in our democracy and making things better for everyone. And so, that's really inspired me. I'll be remiss before I go, none of this stuff is free. So here comes the pitch. if you enjoyed what you saw, if you believe in this work, pitch in, runforsomething.net/build. Anything is really appreciated. Literally every dollar means something to us. We have a small budget, a small scrappy team. And every one of these folks, except for Mark, at some point will probably run for election again. So you should definitely follow them, and you should definitely donate to their campaigns. I know Malcolm, Lina have active campaigns right now. The lieutenant governor will be running for re-election in the not too distant future. And Secretary Castro has a group that helps get also amazing public servants elected. You should all make contributions. Mark is fine. But you should definitely follow Democracy Docket.
I wouldn't be here without Run for Something, Russ. I think I need to say that just to underscore the necessity of supporting the organization.
We really appreciate it, and really appreciate all of y'all. Thank you so much for joining this. And yeah, I'm sure we'll be doing this again next year. Maybe we'll be able to do something in person next year. Thanks, everyone. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you so much, Ross.
Everybody.
Everybody have a good night.